So to open this up and set some context, what the topic is should a centralized government be run on a decentralized technology, and does that sort of reconcile or make sense? And that the governments, the way we define them now, are intrinsically centralized, in a sense, command and control. And can the blockchain technology, which is intrinsically decentralized, be useful adjunct to the way governments work now? And we're going to touch on sort of elections and registry, tax, potentially voting, courts, identity, passports, maybe intellectual property, and some topics of that nature. And maybe we can start out with people introducing themselves. And my name's Rhys Jones, and you want to start?
So I'm Jason Potts. I'm director of the Blockchain Innovation Hub, which is, we believe, the world's first social science research institute on blockchain. And we're basically just a bunch of economists and political economists. And what we're trying to do is basically model the blockchain economy as it grows and changes. And one of the key things that we have to model in that process is how blockchains interact with states. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff here.
My name is Ken Goodwin. I'm the Senior Managing Principal of Genesis Capital Market, also an advisor to LuToken also. So we work within the actual fintech, redtech space. We also do work with blockchain as well as artificial intelligence. My background originally came from the Federal Reserve, as well as the Bank of Japan, as well as also here on Wall Street.
Hey everyone, you guys hear me? Everyone, my name is Christian Ferry. I'm a board member of the Blockchain Compliance Alliance. It's an organization made of companies and government agencies like the SEC and other individuals that strive to create a new ICO standards with a motive to sensitize and harmonize relationship with government, as well as legitimize the space from bad publicity that we see from Bitcoin and so forth, so that we can really expand this market outside. So we can really expand the market just outside the blockchain community.
So intrinsically, a government, the way they're classically defined, is attached to a nation state, essentially a physical location with borders and boundaries and a population of people who live there or identify themselves as being part of that government, and their identity and passport and so forth is controlled or part of that government. And then the government essentially is to manage the affairs of the citizens, and the citizens have maybe a difference of opinion about what they want versus what the government wants. And some of these kind of issues relate to how a distributed system might impact that. And we talked a little at beforehand about some example countries of whether it's easier for an established country to adopt some of these blockchain type techniques to keep track of the information in the country. And is that easier for almost a failed state which has no infrastructure and no precedent, or is it easier for an advanced government that has everything in order? And there were some opinions about that. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental paradox here, and the basic question is how blockchain globalizes, what this looks like from a global economic perspective. And the naive assumption here is that we sort of think of this as this will just follow what citizens want, right? If we want such a thing to happen, then eventually governments will adopt these measures, and we'll sort of see blockchain adoption gradually move around the world in proportion to its value to citizens. And what that overlooks quite fundamentally is, first of all, citizens and governments don't always want the same things, and around some quite fundamental issues they want exactly the opposite things. The basic one is taxation. Citizens don't like paying taxes, governments love it when you pay taxes. There's a fundamental conflict there. And given that this is, in a sense, a technology of tax avoidance, there's a huge issue here that doesn't get talked about enough. The other aspect of this story is If you think about the benefits that blockchain technology can bring, not just in terms of payments, but in terms of registries and data management, and just essentially providing the digital information infrastructure to run a nation. The nations that need this the most, the nations that would benefit, would have the highest marginal benefit from this, are precisely the ones that are probably not going to get it. And the reason for this is that if you have low quality institutions, you're going to benefit from a better institutional technology, blockchain. But if you've got low quality institutions in the first place, that's the hardest possible way to actually adopt a new, to basically bridge this gap. So an example is in terms of property title registries. And just if you look around the world, every country could benefit from moving their property title registries to the blockchain. But if you look at where it's actually started to happen and where it looks like the progress will be made, it's Sweden, it's Estonia, it's Singapore. We can run through a list of other ones, but what they all have in common is governments that you already kind of trust, or high quality institutions. So the reason that the high quality institutions are able to make that transition is it's quite different from the payment system, where if we don't like the way money is working, if there's inflation, citizens can just individually move to the blockchain. But if I want to send you money, we'll just do it that way. I don't have to seek government permission or cooperation to do that. But if I want to start moving asset titles around, and those registries are already with the state, and I can't just decide to do this unilaterally. We can't just do this peer-to-peer. We need state cooperation to at least onboard that mechanism. And this is the fundamental paradox that we're still wrestling with here, is that the places around the world where we're seeing greatest blockchain technology adoption and where the frontiers of this are moving beyond payments into other use cases, registries in particular, are precisely the places that don't really need it, whereas the places that do are the ones that are fundamentally, we're not likely to see a lot of progress there. So I think this is sort of one of these basic global issues that we need to start focusing on.
Go ahead.
I think trust is a key issue. I think you got to go back to the core characteristic of blockchain. It is trust. It's based off a trust system. The institutions there are actually like your primary, they're really your constituents into actually helping to create policies and procedures to ensure that the government's going to operate smoothly. And that's from a tax level, from a local level, from a registry level, and so forth. So I think it's a flux, because here in the U.S. you have some very solid institutions, but yet we're not taking on blockchain as fast. But yet we have larger corporations that are looking to actually infuse that in their supply chain, but yet our government is pretty much taking a very measured approach in terms of looking at it. Doesn't mean that they're not interested in it whatsoever. It just means that it's going to take a little period of time for it to happen. So I think it's back to the core essential of, when I think of trust, I think of Alex de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, right? The idea that citizens are they have one particular idea, they hope that the government is reflective of the citizens, and that's going to be able to have a kind of a harmonious way in society in terms of how they're going to manage individuals, in terms of registrations, in terms of intellectual property, in terms of actual going about passports and so forth. So I think it's got to be it's got to go back to the core characteristic of what a blockchain is, which is having a trust system that people feel comfortable with, that the government is going to have all this information and data, and that they're going to have the right policies and procedures in place that's going to service them in the end.
Yeah, when we talk about trying out blockchain, there's a lot of governments in the developed countries like Sweden and so forth, that they're trying to figure it out, like how this thing is, right? From a government perspective, especially, they're just they understand the value. The problem that we are facing right now is a lot of these developed countries, they already have legacy systems, legacy processes. They're really hard to kind of break through. There's a different culture, and basically the question is, why do you want to spend all this money? The switching costs are huge, right? I don't know how technical you guys are, but the point that technology of blockchain right now is not efficient, right? It takes a tremendous amount of time to kind of process information, to store information. So for them, it's like, why do I have to go through this hustle when I have something that is good enough,
In my mind, the biggest breakthrough we'll see in developing countries, like Kenya is doing, Rwanda. A lot of other developing countries are really trying blockchain because they have nothing to lose. They have no system in place. They have no infrastructure, no legacy plays, no legacy processes, and they're more willing to risk it. It's so-called leapfrogging, right? So there's a lot that we can learn from those places. Lyft actually was created by the founders actually going down to Africa and see how the people, I think in Kenya, they were actually bringing people around. They're just going to say, hey, I have a car, and just take people around and say, wait, why don't we put an app on it? They came back, they created Lyft, look it up. So there's a lot of this technology, I think, that can come, there's a lot of the learning that can come from developing countries, and I think we'll see a lot more of that.
So another distributed versus centralized concept related to this is each of us are a citizen of a particular country, but we're also citizens of the internet, and so we're sort of dual citizens in at least that respect, and sometimes more. And so we're already dealing with the multi-government system, and from a centralized type of government, one of the decentralized aspects having to do with tax and intellectual property and trade and so forth is our treaties, in that the way taxation is done and the way identity is done and the way intellectual property flows and physical goods flow is on treaties between different countries, and that there are those that are participants in the treaty and those that are not. And so as we move towards a more global distributed way of keeping track of information like blockchain, there are some parallels for the way treaties have evolved and are structured, and the way those relate to the things I mentioned, but also things like regulation and criminality and what's acceptable to trade from one country to another, as well as how things are taxed and how ownership and intellectual property is handled, and money in general. So I wonder if each of you have thoughts about those kind of concepts.
Yeah. So treaties are basically ways to make multiple countries behave as if they're just a single country. And the value of that is just lower transactions costs. You get to move value around crossing borders as if those borders weren't there. But in really important ways, those borders are still there. And so if you go back to one of the foundational things that a government does and has done since the 12th century is it provides identity services. Right? Government is in the identity business, and governments need to have identity because they want to tax you. Once upon a time, they would want to conscript you. They would have all of their reasons for knowing who you are, and crucially, not having multiple identities. Governments love single identities, more than 0, less than 2. Anything other than that is problematic. It enables you just to avoid things and do the things that they don't want you to have. Citizens love having multiple identities. That's a benefit as a citizen. It's a terrible thing as a government. And this is one of these issues that as you sort of move around between countries, if we now have a world of treaties, that identity management across borders becomes a huge issue from so we can think of it, we were talking about in the previous panel from a refugee perspective, but it's also from this global taxation perspective. And I think this is another sort of area of conflict that's being set up where these issues around identity and the subsequent follow-on issues for registration, for taxation, for et cetera, look like they're going to start following these same patterns that we've set up for trade treaties, where there's a club of countries that are all on the inside, and then those are on the outside, where you're basically a non-citizen.
That could be a problem, actually. When you look at it, it could actually make it to a non-borderless trade, or it could make it to a point where you do have this kind of clump of one trade group, and that's very exclusive. and you also have the other ones that's non-exclusive. But you also have to get back, when you think of trade, trade is it's a complex process. So it doesn't just include just a country in itself. The country has to look at individuals, industries. So let's go back into Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, right? So let's look at the 7 pillars of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which includes intellectual property, includes small media enterprises, it includes small businesses, as well as include the tariffs themselves. So even if you break down the tariffs was done on an industry basis. There were certain tariffs that took a lot longer to implement because you dealt with the very local level. And I'll give you a case in point. One of the countries that were involved was Japan, right? So Japan had farmers, right, that was really, really close to the industry, but it also had a direct impact to how they actually elect the prime minister. And that was a key impediment for Japan relative to the US in terms of the TPP. So you have to look at, from a treaty standpoint, from a trade standpoint, in that sense, I think blockchain is great for that sense, where it's going to allow for a more conduciveness, where it's going to decentralize it, it's going to allow for much more faster processes, but then at the same time, it may exclude other countries that may not participate in that trade itself. So that's something that we have to really look at going forward.
This is the two biggest user cases. Is international communication between states, it's passport, it's taxes, and second that you mentioned is countries with not developed institutions, where powerful players can change records to their benefits, such as voting, such as property registry rights, and maybe court decisions, and so on.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent point. Somebody said 3Ds before, and you know, I see that to be like a long far out. I don't see that being like something that we do right now. I was on the phone with the European Commission 3 weeks ago. Their lofty goal was to unify Europe, basically removing all the digital boundaries, right? So if you're a French citizen living in Germany, you'll be able to get your birth certificate in Germany, right? So that means basically getting all the state member European Union on one blockchain data system, right? And it's a very lofty goal to do now. I do think, though, there's a lot of the first implementation in the government space will come from the local level more than at the federal level, because that's where the citizens actually, you know, citizens mainly at the local level. They don't go to Washington, right?
Exactly.
So if you think about birth certificates, DMV, you know, all the information is there. You don't have to go to the DMV, and you know, for us in California, it's like at least 2.5 hour wait. You gotta take half a day off, right? So there's a lot of these, you know, common sense problems that I think you can solve. You know, and I think it's gonna end up into the treaties, right? There's gonna be definitely like some sort of like an agreement among, you know, different countries. But you know, I don't think we're there yet from a technology perspective, a cultural perspective, and you know, an independence perspective. So.
Sure. Yes, I mean, in a sense here, we need to just it's worth asking the question, just what actually is a country, or what is a nation? And, you know, because we've had them for, 700, 800 years now, we're kind of used to them as, we think of them as natural objects in the world rather than the artificial objects they are. From an economic perspective, a nation is just a solution to a public goods problem, right? It's just how do we deal with a bunch of externalities? Answer, we have a governance mechanism we call government, and we give it some monopoly powers to do taxation and to use force to provide public goods. So are we going to have new nation states in this sense, and in the sense of redrawing those boundaries with treaties? I think probably not. I think actually the correct answer is this. What we'll have is we'll solve the public goods problem the same way we did right from the beginning, is it'll emerge from the bottom up. We'll start to see new public goods coalitions emerge at the very local level. This might be at the level of streets coming together. A group of neighbors will basically put their garbage problems or their just how to deal with the watering of the plants issue on a blockchain, and they'll have smart contracts to enforce that, and this sort of DAO token for that particular street will be a thing that we wouldn't recognize as a nation state, but it's the seedling of a new type of public good collective action problem. So I think this is exactly what we're likely to see, is this explosion of, at the moment we have 192 nation states. Possibly in a very short space of time we could have then 1 million, then 10 million, and we'll rethink of these things that we think of as districts or regions or neighborhoods. Basically,
I think that's actually where we're going to head towards. I mean, the whole gerrymandering issue will probably be almost gone, basically, because now you're really starting off at the grassroots. And that's really the key, the grassroots, going at that local level. So I agree with you 100%. And that's going to actually key in nicely to the election process, right? How do we actually go about and have elections and government officials, which is, I think, Reese was another key component that we was going to talk about.
But another aspect of that is to notice that organic self-selection mechanism is a self-selection mechanism. It's people basically choosing their country by choosing who they want to form public goods with, as opposed to the model we have now where you're just assigned to a geographic region by birth, and that's your country.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a use case there. I want to call out the importance. I think it's something that Jason, right? You're saying is we live in the developed world, so our real pressing problem is to kind of avoid the line on a Friday at a DMV. There are countries where people have no ID, and those are countries where prone to human trafficking. So there's a lot the blockchain can do, to kind of help people get ID and to basically avoid or reduce human trafficking. That's another use case the government are looking into, especially in developing countries.
But that's not developing countries. You got that here in New York City. That's not a developing. I mean, we have that problem here in New York City.
It's 80-20. I think there's a lot of happening in developing countries, unfortunately, right? So that's where they start, but I think it can be applied worldwide.
Right. I mean, you can apply that here in New York City, where people need IDs to buy products and services. So that's not even a developed issue. That's a global issue. So we have to take this from a global perspective here. And I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. You can apply that to anybody. And that's the good thing about blockchain, that's going to allow for that.
Well, Kristen and Valentine brought up some useful points in that it's not only a global thing, but it's also a local thing, that it may be blockchain is more effective locally. And Valentine's point that in terms of keeping the records of, say, who owns property, in many countries, if you go with a gun into the records office of the title holdings and say with your gun, take out this title holding and put in mine instead, that's the only record that exists. And you can change the records by a simple mechanism like that. And one of the attractive things about blockchain is that it doesn't forget. There's a record of what was there before, there's a record of the change that was made, and that you can at least understand the chain of custody of things. But that also brings up what is the downside of that? And what came up in Europe with a slightly different ideology than the US is the right to be forgotten was an important issue, in that in a number of jurisdictions they changed the laws to say I have the right to disappear from Google if I choose, or at least not be in the first 2 pages. And so once you're in blockchain for your medical records or criminality or any kind of history that you might want to have disappear, that's not so easy in a blockchain. So it's not completely a panacea to have a record of everything that happened that you might choose to have disappear if you want.
So, who would like to summarize our discussion? Or what are key points? So, what will be the roadmap for future government politicians who wants to make his government on blockchain?
I'll take a stab. We started out with whether a decentralized system like blockchain, how that maps onto a centralized system like government, whether that's local or nation state or global. How do those reconcile? And they're slightly different, although they're both trying to keep records and keep order and serve the people that are in the records. And so the issues with that have to do with money and trade and tax and identity and ownership of real and intellectual properties. And so those kind of things are slightly in conflict, whether you use a decentralized system to facilitate a centralized system. And so that's the dilemma that we talked about a bit and some of the issues we touched on.
Yeah. And I add that for a country which has not strong institutions, there are many cases when politicians can change records on their benefit, and this kind of makes them more powerful. It's about elections, it's about court decisions, it's about government spending and so on, and property registry rights. All of this can be kind of fixed with blockchain. And by the way, Georgia implemented blockchain property rights. It's a country which is former CIS member. Now we have countries with blockchain property rights.
If I just add a point to this, I mean, basically there's two ways you can steal, right? You can use force directly. I can just take something from you, or I can rewrite the ledger. I can change the underlying who's on, what the data on the property rights actually says. And we just have to always remember that a lot of this discussion around the nature of the state in terms of this fundamental crypto-anarchist libertarian technology, which was originally intended and built as a kind of way to escape the state, what it was only ever escaping was the writing part. Now, the frontiers of when we're thinking about RegTech and the ability of smart contracts to automatically execute payments, if conditional payments. The thing that still hasn't been addressed or sits behind that is and then what happens in the use of force case.
That's right.
And ultimately, a government is a monopoly on violence, right? And that makes economic sense in the sense that that should be an efficient way to ensure that you only ever have value moving around when the ledger changes and not the use of threat. But I think this is sort of an issue that we've never really addressed.
Yeah. Who actually owns the records of it? Yeah. Is it centralized back to the government, or does it stay localized? I mean, what do you think is going to happen here? Because if that's the case, if the government owns it, then the government's going to have the right to go in and take your property.
That's a good point. If I knew, $1 million. But we don't know yet. I think there's also going to be technology is going to be playing a big part. I don't think we're ready there to kind of like roll out all the services we want. But I do say one thing is that we always expect the government to take action and to be this wonderful, super efficient technological machine. Unfortunately, the government is not. Any government, I think, that's bureaucracy in it. So I'm saying, every single one of us in this room, in this world, can actually pitch the government services they would like to see, right? We can all come together, sign petitions and say, we would like to be able to do this and this and this, and I think we can do it. So I'm suggesting not just a top-down approach, but also a bottom-up, right? Just kind of, let's all be proactive and say how we would like the government and our interaction with society to be, thanks to blockchain.
Great, thanks a lot. So now let's turn to questions.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting because when we think about blockchain, we think about decentralization, but then we're talking about government, which is highly centralized, and having this really irony around the very conversation is really enlightening. My question is, there's a technological evolution also happening, right? I mean, right now we're just talking about processes and protocols and so on and so forth, but this evolution of AI is happening, this automation is happening. There's a lot of things that are also moving parallelly. When that is happening, what is the role of government anyway? What does governance truly mean? Can you really govern the machines the way you would govern humans and the human systems? That's one. In that context, what is truly a nation? I think we're going towards the model of city-state. Like in Singapore, it's easy to deploy things and manage and provide services. In a city environment, I can't no longer manage in a nation environment. If you take example of India, 1.2 billion people is impossible to manage a singular country and deploy everything, regardless of what systems they use. So breaking apart, having smaller chunks, smart cities, smarter communities, smart regions that are more interplayed with technology is really the evolution. So in that context, record keeping, evolution of blockchain, or whatever else comes with it, I just want to understand your points of view on how do you see that?
So we've been trying to model this as economists trying to figure out what's going on here. And what this looks like to us, and this is not just our group, other economists have made the same argument, is that blockchain is an institutional technology that competes, that we should see as on a spectrum with firms, hierarchies, markets, right? What's going on here is that as transactions costs fall dramatically because of this technology, hierarchies become less competitive. So firms get smaller, governments get smaller, markets get bigger. This is a dramatic, radical, global explosion of markets. And a lot of the sort of ICOs and things that are being pitched here and elsewhere are essentially dealing with things that used to be market failures, i.e. reasons for governments to exist or reasons for large hierarchical organizations to exist. That space is shrinking. Those boundaries are being pushed inside. So, what does this world look like? Answer, enormous explosion of a global market economy.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be less competitive. I actually think it's going to be more operating efficiently. So what you're going to find, because you can take blockchain and you can apply that across different asset spectrums. So the application of that is going to increase the efficiency of a lot of these corporations. I thought you brought a very good point in terms of smart cities. That's actually happening now. So what you're finding a lot of these smart cities that's going around the globe. You have that here in New York City, you have that in other locations. And the benefit of that is that they're grabbing that first. I think that's a huge benefit, a huge advantage that they have is that they're taking technology and they're applying that across different spectrums. So you have that within government. And the way it works with smart cities, it is data centered. So the idea is how does government, central government, uses that data to actually provide the services. And of course you have the private sector side that's around that. So those cities and those smart cities programs that take advantage of that, they're going to be far more ahead of the curve than everyone else.
So another aspect of that is that city-states have a huge advantage in this world because of regulatory agility. They can just move faster. They can make the deals necessary in a way that a much larger, the US-sized thing just simply cannot move that fast. So, city-states connected through a global market economy looks like the direction that this technology is pushing us towards.
And another thing to consider is there's the governments of the physical world, and then there's the governments of the virtual world, which are like Google and Amazon and Apple and Facebook and so forth. And you can be affected by those governments maybe more profoundly than you might be by your local civic government, or and that where the authority and power over people's lives is starting to shift. And is Bitcoin and blockchain part of that virtual world more than it is the physical world? It seems as though it is, and that. If you're mean to your Uber driver, maybe your Amazon delivery will be delayed, or
Sorry, I missed your name?
Anita.
Anita, it's a wonderful question, and really got me thinking. And I think there's no really right or wrong way to answer the question, but to think about a short term and a long term. I do think I concur with my panelists here that in the short term we're going to see like the shift in the governments, how it's going to benefit the current process, the current system, and make things more efficient. But I do agree with you that the important focus here is on the long term. Is what is government, right? I think we're starting this looking at the technology of the blockchain, but in reality, this is much bigger than this. Somebody said an explosion of markets. I think it's a paradigm shift. It's an entire change of human psychology. It's like a different way to think about things. We start thinking that the parts are bigger than the whole, right? It's basically we understand that if we all work together, we might not even need a government, right? So that's really, to me, it's a movement more than anything else. I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow. It's probably going to happen in 100 years. But I think that
with the blockchain got us thinking, say, what if we actually can do this? What the world will look like? So I think it's a wonderful question, and thank you for asking that question.
Thank you. Last question, please.
Hi, I'm interested if you have any insights on how the intelligence community think about blockchain. Like, how is FBI thinking about it? How are the other similar institutions thinking about the potentials of blockchain and intelligence community? And my second question is whether you think blockchain has the potential to be the global passport of the future. So we all have one ID, and that ID sits on blockchain. And if you want to go from US to Germany, you just swipe your phone at the airport and move on. So there's no vetting, there's no all these immigration problems that we have today. Do you see blockchain having that potential?
Yeah, well, this is already happening where as you move from one country to another, they look not only at your passport, but they look at your social media profile and all of the transactions that are in your phone and so forth. So your virtual identity and persona is much part of your profile and identity as your government-issued documents. And so this is, as the AI systems and computer systems get better, to profile people based on maybe some government-issued identity, but all of the other aspects of virtual identity that you have, it does create a very different world in terms of who you are and how you move about and what people can know about you, and then how you would do that in a tracing way. And it's come up a few times, the KYC and know your customer and anti-money laundering things where people toss out saying, well, our token, we're now knowing our customers and investigating money laundering. Well, how thoroughly are they actually doing that? And are they actually just subjecting themselves to a liability of saying, well, we're screening for anti-money laundering, but maybe we didn't do it adequately, but we said we did, and so therefore we're liable too for that.
There's a fundamental difference here between using blockchain technology as essentially a certification or verification technology of a centralized identity. So I can use blockchain to verify that my Australian government identity is real, versus the far more ambitious and more from the security perspective, from the government security perspective, worrying concern is this notion of identity as a private property right, a thing that I own, and I'll permission you to see who I am, and I'll basically a permissioning model of privately granted identity as a kind of global property right compared to a sort of certification model of identity. I think that's kind of where we're up to right now, is this tension between these two different fundamental architectures, centralized identity on the blockchain versus decentralized identity as a native concept, as essentially a property right rather than a validation or a trusted point.
Thanks a lot. I think that some of the people there can get an idea how to create a new blockchain state. Perhaps we help to burn a new politician there. We'll vote for him, but just remind in your program that you was inspired by these guys.
Use